American Legends, The Life of J.P. Morgan, by Charles River Editors. Introduction. John Pierpont Morgan, 1837 to 1913. Go as far as you can see. When you get there, you'll be able to see farther. J.P. Morgan. A lot of ink has been spilled covering the lives of history's most influential figures, but how much of the forest is lost for the trees? In Charles River Editors' American Legends series, you can get caught up to speed on the lives of America's most important men and women in the time it takes to finish a commute, while learning interesting facts long forgotten or never known. The Gilded Age and the dawn of the 20th century are often remembered as an era full of monopolies, trusts, and economic giants in heavy industries like oil and steel. Men like Andrew Carnegie built empires like Carnegie Steel. John D. Rockefeller partnered with railroads to create an oil titan. And the era also made names like Astor, Cook, Gold, and Vanderbilt instantly recognizable across the globe. Over time, the unfathomable wealth generated by the businesses made the individuals on top incredibly rich, and that in turn led to immense criticism and an infamous epithet used to rail against them, robber barons. Dozens of men were called robber barons, but few were as notorious or as rich as John Pierpont Morgan, a financier and banker who bankrolled the consolidation of behemoth corporations across various industries. Morgan was behind the merging of Edison General Electric and Thomson-Houston Electric Company, which subsequently became General Electric, still known simply as GE across the world today. Similarly, he financed Federal Steel Corporation and consolidated various other steel businesses to help form the United States Steel Corporation. While critics complained about the outsized influence that these gigantic businesses had, Morgan's massive wealth also gave him unprecedented power in the financial sector and the ability to deal with politicians. In fact, Morgan played an important part in the Panic of 1907 and the subsequent decision to create the Federal Reserve as a monetary oversight. The industrial might wielded by men like Morgan directly led to a public backlash and made President Teddy Roosevelt the trust buster. And there has since been countless regulations to attempt to avoid the types of monopolies found over 100 years ago. However, many 20th century historians and writers pushed back against the allegations hurled at the robber barons and even took issues with the name. Morgan may have used his wealth to collect everything from jewelry to yachts, but he was also celebrated for spending enormous sums of money on charitable works and public service projects. As a result, Morgan's reputation is still mixed, even as his legacy is felt over 100 years after his death. Chapter 1. The Early Years of J. Pierpont Morgan. When you expect things to happen, strangely enough, they do happen. J.P. Morgan. To Junius Spencer Morgan, childhood was merely a warm-up for adulthood. It was that way for him when he was a boy, and he saw to it that his son, John Pierpont Morgan, known to most people as Pierpont, had a similar experience. The fact that his son showed an aptitude for numbers was a good sign as well, because, for Junius, there were few things in life more important than business. Junius Morgan. While it is true that Junius inherited a great deal of his wealth from his father, Joseph Morgan, and Pierpont would also benefit from his own father's generous inheritance, Junius was a tireless worker. The same would also be said for Pierpont, although it could not be said that being the world's foremost investment banker would ever bring Pierpont much joy. Junius was a tall, handsome, sturdy man whose presence in a room was hard to ignore, and his son would also inherit this ability to command attention. In fact, one person would later say that encountering Pierpont left him feeling as if a gale had blown through the house. For his own part, Junius could be alternately charming and reserved, but either way, he rarely ever lost control of his emotions, and he raised his son to avoid putting his feelings on public display. However, Pierpont was not as adept at this as his father, and even as a young child, Pierpont would discover that his feelings often surfaced one way or another. For him, stress and emotions frequently manifested themselves in the form of various physical maladies, although it is not clear if he understood their origins. Another way that Pierpont emulated his father was in the type of woman he chose to marry. While he deeply loved his first wife, Pierpont's relationship with his second wife was eerily similar to that of his parents, distant. Junius married Juliet Pierpont in May 1836, shortly after becoming a partner in a dry goods business in his hometown of Hartford, but in many ways it seemed as if marrying Juliet was more akin to checking off a box on a list than a marriage bound of love and passion. It was simply time for Junius to settle down, and Juliet was chosen to be his wife. Her own youth was largely spent caring for her mother, who suffered from what today would likely be diagnosed as depression and assorted physical problems. At the time, Juliet could not have known that her fate would not be much unlike her mother's. Also, like her mother, Juliet developed the capacity to exhaust those charged with seeing to her care and well-being. Within weeks of the honeymoon, Juliet was pregnant with her first child, and John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837. He was baptized by his maternal grandfather, the fiery Reverend John Pierpont, and his arrival was followed by Mary Lyman in 1844 and Junius Spencer, Jr. in 1846. Although Pierpont was the eldest son, when Junius Jr. died at the age of 12, it cemented the notion that Pierpont would follow in his father's footsteps and assume the position as his heir. In February 1838, when he was not quite 2 years old, Pierpont developed seizures, but even though the cause was never determined, the seizures stopped in the fall, just as mysteriously as they began. Even after they were gone, however, neither Pierpont nor his family was ever able to completely shake the anxiety that the seizures caused, and he was frequently considered frail or sickly, compelling his parents to keep him out of school at the first sign of illness. Not surprisingly, Pierpont internalized the idea that he was not well and carried it with him for the rest of his life, constantly fearing that the end of one disease or condition merely meant the beginning of another. If Juliet had a significant impact on her son, it is not clear, because it seems that Pierpont was far more influenced by both of his grandfathers. Junius and his family lived with his own parents for about a year, and the Morgans had more than enough room to spare. Joseph Morgan was a well-known businessman who celebrated the day that Andrew Jackson left office, and he was the biggest influence in Junius's life. So perhaps it was only natural that Joseph and his wife became like second parents to Pierpont, who enjoyed going to the Episcopal Church with Grandpa Morgan and singing hymns. Visitors frequently passed through the doors of the Morgan mansion, which was kept running by a variety of white and black servants, gardeners, and farm laborers. When he was 9 years old, Pierpont was sent to the school at the Episcopal Academy in Cheshire, Connecticut, but he returned home just 3 months later when his grandfather became ill. Joseph Morgan died the following summer on July 23, 1847, leaving an estate valued at over $1 million. On the other side of the family, his grandpa Pierpont was a strong advocate for social justice, including important causes of the day such as temperance and the abolition of slavery. His impassioned sermons got him fired in 1839 because his parishioners felt he was too quick to criticize government and altogether lacking the meekness and modesty that they wanted to see in a Christian. J.P. Morgan's time at the Episcopal Academy was just one stop of 9 separate schools that was charged with his education before he reached the age of 20. There was little doubt that the constant moving around made it difficult for him to feel settled, and few, if any, would have described him as a scholar, although his interest in art was evident early on. He was known as a bit of a troublemaker, with a good sense of humor, but it probably did not help that letters from his mother tended to focus on her own troubles, or long-distance criticism of his grammar, lack of gratitude for care packages, or the frequency of letters home. While most mothers would likely be thrilled to hear from their children as often as possible, Juliet discouraged him from writing more than once a week, whether he was homesick or not. Junius accepted a job in Boston in 1850, but Pierpont's attempts to complete his schooling there were interrupted by more ailments, including headaches, sore throats, and mysterious boils on his face and neck. Nevertheless, these medical issues did not stop him from playing football, fishing, or sailing, and there was never any official reason given for his ailments. In 1851, he passed the entrance exam for the English High School in Boston, a renowned academy for math and business preparation, but the following year, a bout with rheumatic fever caused him to not only miss school, but left him in so much pain that he could hardly walk. Junius decided that the sea air would speed along Pierpont's recovery, so he sent his son to the Azores in Portugal. Pierpont was not joined by his parents or other family, but the U.S. consul to the Azores, Charles W. Dabney. Pierpont was desperately lonely in Portugal, and the waits for letters or packages from his family were agonizing. Whether the delays in contacting their son were avoidable or simply an attempt to toughen him up is not clear, but after 4 months he was ready to return home. Junius and Juliet did let him leave Portugal, but instead of coming home, Pierpont was sent to Europe, where the next phase of his life began. Chapter 2. Europe and New York. Pierpont as a young adult. No problem can be solved until it is reduced to some simple form. The changing of a vague difficulty into a specific, concrete form is a very essential element in thinking. J.P. Morgan. As Pierpont continued his recovery from rheumatic fever in 1853, his father was contemplating a job opportunity with the prestigious Peabody Bank in London, so the Morgan family, including Pierpont, joined him there. From there, they continued on with a tour of Belgium, France, and Germany, but Pierpont was enamored with British culture, especially after his visits to Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey. This marked the first of many trips that he would make to Europe in his lifetime, either to visit his father, to recuperate from illness, or simply to escape the pressure of being J.P. Morgan. Meanwhile, for Junius, his eventual decision to agree to a partnership was not a difficult one. George Peabody, a merchant banker from Baltimore, was in the market for someone to take over his business. A man of wealth, Peabody was a bachelor with no obvious heir to his fortune, so he was looking for an American family man who had some understanding of foreign trade. Junius certainly fit the bill, so in October 1854, Junius moved his family to London, where he would live for the rest of his life and manage the European operations of what would become known as the House of Morgan. George Peabody. Even from London, Junius continued to pull the strings on Pierpont's life. After Pierpont graduated from English high school, Junius decided that the next phase in his training as an international banker would be in Europe, so he arranged for his son to attend a private boarding school in Switzerland. Following that, Pierpont attended Göttingen University in Germany, where he studied German and French. Though he had done a lackluster job in school as a teen, he impressed one of his professors at Göttingen with his math skills, so much that the professor suggested Pierpont consider an academic appointment there. Of course, that was not to be Pierpont's destiny if his father had anything to say about it. At 19, Pierpont graduated from Göttingen, and while on a tour of Rome, he got a first-hand look at some of the finest art and architecture the world has ever known. Though he had shown a keen interest in art as a student, this was the beginning of his life as a serious art collector. The more money he would acquire over the course of his life, the more he would spend on art. In addition to collecting art, there was little doubt that Pierpont liked all kinds of nice things. His carefully kept ledgers give a glimpse into the lifestyle that he led in Europe, and he seemed to spare no expense to indulge his expensive taste, buying leather boots and gloves, aromatic colognes, and in the style of the times, a beaver hat. For his female relatives and friends, he purchased fur coats and stoles, while he also indulged in his desire for antique manuscripts with purchases of historic texts and novels. In France, Pierpont visited the great sites that most tourists want to see, including the Louvre, Versailles, and Napoleon's tomb. These experiences, as much as anything learned in the classroom, prepared him for a career as an international investment banker, not to mention becoming one of the world's premier art collectors. Pierpont's career as a Wall Street banker began near the bottom as an unpaid clerk at Duncan, Sherman & Company in 1857. The office was just east of the New York Stock Exchange and Board, which at the time traded shares in railroads, canals, banks, gaslighting companies, and mining companies. Not surprisingly, his father arranged this apprenticeship after assuring the firm that the young man he was sending to them held great promise. Wall Street was well on its way to becoming the financial capital of the world, and even though 1857 was a volatile year in the U.S. economy, Pierpont wasted little time displaying his willingness to take risks, something that frightened not only the firm's elder statesman, but Junius himself. Pierpont spent a significant portion of the firm's cash on Brazilian coffee, and when the shipment arrived in the New York City port with no buyer, Pierpont was able to buy it and turn around and sell it, all for a tidy profit. He never doubted the scheme for a second. Another one of Pierpont's responsibilities in New York was keeping Junius apprised of the political and economic climate in the U.S., So twice a week, Pierpont sat down and wrote detailed accounts of the events in America and sent them off to his father in London. This was almost a decade before the transatlantic cable was laid, leaving Europe reliant on mail for information about American markets. Since that could take weeks, the ability of Junius to receive this type of intelligence on government financing or the credit statuses of major clients was invaluable. That same winter, Pierpont's mother was back in the U.S., hoping that a change of scenery would improve her health and her mood. One of the first things that Pierpont did when he arrived was to go to Boston to check on her, but he found her condition the same as it was in London. Juliet had a myriad of complaints ever since arriving in London, most with no obvious origin. But while she may have been diagnosed with some type of anxiety disorder today, there was little that could be done for her in the 19th century, other than trying to keep her in an environment that made her happy and trying not to upset her. She was not at ease in social situations like her husband was, and being in a foreign nation that did not go out of its way to welcome Americans had not helped matters. Her conditions only worsened when all of her children were away at school and Junius was busy immersing himself in London's business and social networks. Chapter 3. The Civil War Years. If you have to ask how much it costs, you can't afford it. J.P. Morgan. Still just a young man at 20 years old, Pierpont also took advantage of the New York social scene. Already more worldly than most Americans would ever be in the 19th century, he took to the diversity and the hustle and bustle of New York City immediately, and it would truly be home for the rest of his life. The lack of a salary was not a concern because Junius sent him $200 a month, a large sum of money for a bachelor at that time, and Pierpont shared a row house on West 17th Street with George Peabody's son and another young man. From there, Pierpont could walk to work or take a horse-drawn carriage. Pierpont constantly made friends through business contacts, and it was on one of these social calls that he met Amelia Sturgis, known to most people as Mimi, pronounced Mimi. She was the daughter of Jonathan Sturgis, a prominent businessman who began in the wholesale grocery business before turning to the railroad business. When they met in 1858, the 23-year-old Mimi was 2 years older than Pierpont, and though she was not nearly as well-traveled, she played the piano, sang, and taught sewing to young women at a trade school on the Lower East Side. The previous fall, she had been named a beauty queen at a local ball. Mimi. As charmed as Pierpont was by her, so was Junius. When Junius discovered that she had never traveled to Europe, he offered to rectify the situation immediately by inviting her to return to London with him, along with Pierpont's cousin, Sally Goodwin. Pierpont was not very pleased by the development, but in the spring of 1859, with her father's consent, Mimi accompanied Junius and Sally Goodwin on board the SS Persia, bound for London. The winter departure made for rough seas, but Mimi seemed not to care in the slightest. When others were kept below the deck with seasickness, she never missed a meal and passed her time by reading, playing backgammon, and touring the boat with the ship's captain as her guide. Sally remarked in her journal how joyful and full of life Mimi was on the trip across the Atlantic, and like Pierpont and Junius, Mimi was taken with London as soon as she arrived. She also reveled in her first car ride with Junius through the city. Junius was a generous host, frequently offering the best food and drink, even as Juliet was too depressed to join in the festivities much of the time. Through it all, Mimi faithfully wrote letters to Pierpont in New York, and in the spring, Mimi's parents and brothers joined her in London for what was also their first trip to Europe. Mimi and her family traveled through Europe together and followed Pierpont's carefully drawn-up itinerary, one that he believed would show them the best of Europe's great cities. Meanwhile, in September 1859, Junius decided that it was time for Pierpont to leave Duncan Sherman and Company, so he advised his son to write a resignation letter. Pierpont had spent 2 years as an unpaid apprentice there, and Junius felt it was time for Pierpont to take on more responsibility somewhere else. Pierpont left the company on good terms, albeit with advice he might find it easier for him to make his way through the business world if he managed his temper a bit. One of the partners wrote, "Suavity and gentle bearing toward those with whom we deal goes a long way toward making up the capital which ensures success." Within a week, Pierpont was on his way to London. When he arrived, Mimi was still traveling with her family, and Pierpont took that time to talk to his father about his future, both regarding his career and Mimi. As the Sturgis family returned to London and Junius considered his son's next career move, Pierpont's mind was on Mimi. He spent nearly every evening in her company, and when it came time for the Sturgis family to return to New York, he went with them. All of his free time on the boat was spent with Mimi, as it was when they arrived in New York. However, Pierpont was not in New York for long. It was the winter of 1859, and the tension between the northern and southern states over the issue of slavery had been building across the nation. In a year, southern states would secede following the election of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States, and a few months after that, Confederate forces would fire on Fort Sumter. Nonetheless, as the war clouds loomed, Junius sent his son to the South on an intelligence-gathering mission. For the Morgans, the coming war would be as much about economics as it would be about freedom. Pierpont was away from New York for 5 months touring the South, and after he attended sessions of Congress, he was disgusted by the government's ability to come to an agreement that would stave off war. He also observed the cotton trade firsthand, which accounted for the largest export in the U.S. by far. Over 4 million bales of cotton were exported out of the South in 1860 alone. By the time Pierpont returned to New York in May 1860, the new Republican Party had made Lincoln its presidential nominee, while the Democrats were split between Stephen Douglas and Vice President John Breckinridge. Junius was still debating job options for his son when he returned to New York, and he almost sent Pierpont to China. With no immediate job opportunities on Wall Street, he would have rather had Pierpont traveling in Asia and researching trade and business opportunities there than having him live the life of an unemployed bachelor in New York. Pierpont had actually wanted to go to China a few years earlier, only to have his mother soundly reject that idea. However, before any travel plans to China could be finalized, Pierpont and Mimi announced their engagement, which not only pleased Junius, but convinced him that this was not the time for Pierpont to go on an extensive overseas trip. The wedding date was set for October 1861, a year away, but within just a few weeks of her engagement to Pierpont, Mimi developed a cough. It grew progressively worse as time went by, and many in the family, including Mimi herself, began to question the timing of the wedding. She suggested that perhaps they wait until she felt better. Pierpont, who tended to her every need, would not hear of it. The wedding would go on as planned. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Junius was back in London, and though he wrote that he was grateful to be far away from the hostilities, he assumed, like many others, that the war would be over in a matter of weeks anyway. At the time, both Pierpont and Junius were more alarmed at the dissolving of the Union than they were concerned about slavery, and they believed that the U.S. government had failed to do what was necessary to preserve the nation. Going to fight in the war was never a question for Pierpont, despite the fact that he was still without work aside from doing odd jobs for Duncan Sherman and Company. Like many wealthy Americans, he paid $300 for a substitute to take his place. For Pierpont, the Civil War created a business opportunity that might have seemed relatively insignificant at the time, but it was a deal that haunted him for years to come. He partnered with a man named Arthur M. Eastman to sell guns to the Union Army, but little is known about Eastman other than the fact that he was a businessman from Manchester, New Hampshire, who claimed to have some expertise in the area of arms and ammunition. For a man with some knowledge about guns, the war presented the perfect opportunity to make some money, especially since the Union was desperate for any weapons that would provide an advantage against the Confederates. Eastman offered to modernize 5,000 carbine rifles, holdovers from the Mexican-American War, and sell them back to the Union. They had been stored in a warehouse on Governor's Island, just off the tip of Manhattan, and Eastman assured the government that he could modernize the weapons to make them battle-ready. Ordnance Chief James Ripley declined the offer from Eastman, doubting that there would be any way to modernize the guns and make them usable, so Eastman then simply offered to buy the guns for $3.50 each, but he did not have the total of $17,500 needed, and thus needed an investor for that. Meanwhile, after the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, General John C. Fremont, commander of the Western Department, found himself in dire need of weapons, and he spread the word that the government would pay for guns from anyone who had them to sell. At this point, New York lawyer Simon Stevens saw an opportunity to profit from the war. Stevens was aware that Eastman had access to the carbine rifles, so he sent a telegram to Fremont saying that he could arrange to sell the Union some used rifles. He then offered to buy the weapons from the government for $12.50 each. However, like Eastman, Stevens did not have the total, now up to $62,500, to buy the guns. In fact, he did not even have the $20,000 advance to get the deal going. As a result, Stevens contacted Pierpont, who loaned him the first $20,000 and agreed to provide the rest of the total due when the government began making payments. With Pierpont's money, Stevens then brokered a deal with the government to resell the rifles back to the Union for $22 apiece. When the alterations to the rifles took longer than planned, Pierpont backed out of the deal in September, and his father's old business partner, Morris Ketchum, took over the deal in his place. Then came word that the rifles were not only not battle-ready, but dangerous. Rumor had it that some soldiers had their thumbs blown off by the faulty weapons. By October 1861, the government launched an investigation into war profiteering, and there were no more arms payments. But the matter was not settled until 1867, when the government was ordered by the Supreme Court to honor Fremont's original deal. Was J.P. Morgan a war profiteer? It is not clear how much he knew about the deal, or why he really backed out of it. Some historians suggest that Pierpont did not realize that he was dealing the government its own rifles at a profit for himself. His biographer, Gene Strauss, offers the theory that the reason he backed out of the deal had more to do with Mimi than anything. They were only a month away from their wedding, so he may have simply wanted to clear his accounts before his wedding and their departure to Europe. Chapter 4. Pierpont Morgan Starts a Family. A man always has two reasons for doing anything: a good reason and the real reason. J.P. Morgan. As the wedding approached, Mimi's cough had shown no sign of improvement. In fact, it was worse. She and Pierpont would not officially know for a few weeks, but perhaps she suspected the truth, which is that she had tuberculosis. There was no vaccine or cure for tuberculosis in the mid-19th century, and the respiratory disease claimed thousands of lives before a vaccine was discovered almost 100 years later. Still, Pierpont had no intention of postponing the wedding. He believed that taking Mimi to the Mediterranean, where she could breathe in the fresh sea air, would restore her health. By the day of the wedding, October 7, 1861, Mimi was very frail, and she later claimed she was glad to wear a wedding veil so that she could conceal her true appearance. Nonetheless, she soldiered through the reception, and after a day of recovery, she and Pierpont boarded the Persia and headed for Europe. Mimi seemed to rally on the ship as her coughing subsided and she ate well, but when they reached Paris, Pierpont took her to the doctor anyway. The doctor told him, but not Mimi, that she did indeed have tuberculosis, an old tradition that sought to alleviate a sick person's concern by not revealing the true nature of their illness. With that diagnosis, the best that could be done for her was to keep her comfortable with plenty of rest, fresh air, and proper nutrition. Although Pierpont had her diagnosis and plenty of wealth to care for her, the disease progressed rapidly, even though Mimi did what she was told. She ate carefully and rested as much as possible, and Pierpont watched over her carefully, carrying her upstairs when she was too exhausted to make it herself. On what should have been his honeymoon in Paris, Pierpont had to go out alone and return to his wife with flowers or food that he hoped might make her feel better. He kept her family apprised of her condition, but Mimi's father was a little skeptical that her condition was as serious as Pierpont made it to be, due to Pierpont's own tendency of being a hypochondriac. Nevertheless, by late December 1861, Pierpont had summoned his mother-in-law to Europe. At this point, they were in Algiers, and Mimi's condition had deteriorated. Her mother came to help take care of her, and Pierpont made plans for them all to leave Algiers and go to Marseille. He thought another sea voyage might improve her condition, and actually blamed himself for taking her to Algiers in the first place, but when they arrived at the port, the captain of the ship refused to let them board. When he took one look at Mimi, he figured she wouldn't survive the trip, so he told them she was too sick to travel. It was at that point that Pierpont told his wife the truth about her diagnosis. Pierpont somehow arranged for them to make it to Nice, France, although it's still not clear how he pulled that off. Through it all, Junius had been urging his son to go to London to discuss business, and though Pierpont was reluctant to leave his wife, putting off his father was even more difficult. In early February 1862, Pierpont went to see his father, but by the time he made it back to France, Mimi was in her final days. She died on February 17, 1862, just 4 months after her wedding. As Pierpont sank into grief and guilt about being away from Mimi as she lay dying, Junius assured him that there was nothing more that he could have done for his wife. Pierpont and the members of the Sturgis family that had gone to France to see Mimi in her final days left Nice on February 26th, traveling through Italy and France while united in their grief. Pierpont stayed with them until Junius summoned him with the thing that was seemingly always on Junius's mind: work. It should have come as no surprise that after Mimi's death, Pierpont's medical problems reappeared, and the issues that had dissipated in his time with her suddenly began to come to the forefront again. It was a pattern seen time and again. In times of stress or loneliness, Pierpont's headaches, body aches, or sores on his skins would surface. Still, he worked through his grief and settled into life as a bachelor with his cousin and childhood comrade, James Goodwin. In 1862, they opened a new bank, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, in New York. Goodwin, who lived with Pierpont at 42 West 21st Street, liked to joke that he was the "and Company." The new bank primarily traded stocks and government bonds, and with his father steering European investors to his bank from London, Pierpont was able to take advantage of the overseas market of investors who saw an opportunity to make money in the U.S. However, Pierpont had worked so much that by the middle of the year he had again developed severe headaches. Friends and family urged him to take a vacation, and while he agreed, he also admitted to his father that it was difficult for him to give up any control in business dealings, even if his health suffered because of it. It was only during his mental and physical breakdowns that he felt that it was acceptable to offload some of his work responsibilities. It took nearly 2 years before Pierpont began to regain some of his old self back. Always social, largely because he did not like to be alone, he traveled with friends and members of Mimi's family. Meanwhile, as the Civil War dragged on, his profits went up. His firm made $58,000 in 1863, up from $30,000 the previous year. But Junius did not approve of all of his son's business dealings. He was particularly upset when he learned that Pierpont had arranged to buy gold, ship some of it to London to create a shortage and drive up the price, and then sold the rest for a tidy profit of $132,000. Junius was not so upset that his son took advantage of the Union during a war, but that he would be so reckless and gamble so much money on what he termed sheer greed. In 1864, Pierpont's firm was dissolved, and Dabney, Morgan and Company was born. The partners were Pierpont, his cousin, and Charles Dabney. It was also during this time that Pierpont met Frances Louisa Tracy, known to most people as Fanny. She was 22 years old when she began to be courted by 27-year-old Pierpont, and though there was little about her that might remind anyone of Mimi, Pierpont enjoyed her company anyway. The differences between their personalities were apparent, though, and perhaps more careful consideration on either of their parts might have helped them realize that they were an ill-suited pair from the start. Even the ways in which they chose to spend their free time were vastly different. Whereas Pierpont liked to be social and enjoyed having a house full of guests, Fanny enjoyed her quiet time and solitude. Regardless, in March 1865, as the Civil War was drawing to an end, Pierpont and Fanny were engaged to be married. Pierpont did not want a long engagement this time, and initially set the wedding date for June 1st, but it was adjusted to May 31st to account for June 1st being a national day of mourning for the assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Immediately following the wedding, Pierpont and Fanny set sail for Europe, Pierpont's second European honeymoon in less than 4 years. But Fanny did not take to the sea the way Mimi did, perhaps because she was pregnant. Exactly 9 months and 10 days after their wedding, their first child, Louisa, was born. They would have 3 other children after that, Juliet, Anne, and John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., called Jack. A 1913 picture of J.P. Morgan, Sr. and J.P. Morgan, Jr. Anne Morgan. Pierpont enjoyed fatherhood. As far as he was concerned, the more people in the house, the merrier. He found being alone completely depressing, and he would eventually have to go out and find someone to talk to or play cards with him. When Fanny needed a break from all the activity and left the city, Pierpont took it personally and wrote to her, lamenting how lonely he was without her. There were also times that his illness would recur, leaving him incapacitated and depressed. His worries were compounded by his weight, which ballooned up to over 200 pounds. With both of them prone to depression, it was generally an unsatisfying union for both of them, especially since their remedies were so different. Fanny sought the quiet, and Pierpont needed activity or a stay at Saratoga Springs. In the summer of 1868, Morgan was in such a state of anxiety over his health that he spent the entire season in Europe without his family, who remained in their summer house in New York. He even sought out the doctor in Paris who diagnosed Mimi with tuberculosis, wondering if he had also developed the disease. He had not. He was simply unhappy. Chapter 5. The Rise of a Titan. Well, I don't know as I want a lawyer to tell me what I cannot do. I hire him to tell me how to do what I want to do. J.P. Morgan. As the Gilded Age kicked into high gear, Pierpont's net worth was around $350,000, and Junius was worth about $5 million. But it was not just his personal bank account that made J.P. Morgan an industrial giant. There were men who had much more money than he did, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie among them. But what Pierpont had was power. He grew into one of the most powerful bankers in the world, giving him the kind of influence that angered many people and frightened others. There was no shortage of critics who accused him of manipulating the economy for his own good, but there was also no denying that Pierpont stepped in and stabilized the American economy, saving it from collapse more than once. The company that would become J.P. Morgan Chase helped create modern America for better or worse. Rockefeller. Carnegie. When Pierpont and Fannie took their children on a family trip west to California, Pierpont got a first-hand look at the railroad system that his bank was helping fund. There was a tremendous amount of money to be made in railroads in post-Civil War America, thanks largely to the Transcontinental Railroad. For the first time, the country was open from coast to coast, so journeys that used to take months could now be completed in a matter of days. And once the Golden Spike was pounded into the ground at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, everything changed in the U.S. Goods, services, and ideas could travel at the speed of a train, and soon after that, telegraph wires that followed them. The key to Pierpont's influence in the railroad industry came via his partnership with another powerful investment banker, Anthony Drexel. Drexel had been working in banking since he was 13 years old, and he also had international banking interests despite the fact the headquarters of his bank was in Philadelphia, not New York. Junius reached out to Drexel and proposed the idea of a partnership with his son, who Junius believed was in dire need of a mentor. Pierpont was not particularly liked on Wall Street due to his temper and brusque manner. In fact, Pierpont may have simply retired if his father would have allowed it, but that was out of the question, and Drexel agreed to the partnership, leading to the creation of Drexel Morgan & Company, headquartered on Wall Street in New York. The firm opened its doors on July 1, 1871, but Pierpont was not there to see it because he had a condition to agreeing to the partnership. He wanted to take a year off. Thus, within days of the new firm's opening, the Morgans sailed for Europe. Drexel. Drexel Morgan had no problem attracting European investors to the U.S. railroad system, but it was still a competitive, volatile, and at times unscrupulous industry. Fortunately for the company, Drexel's close relationship with the largest corporation in the world, the Pennsylvania Railroad, provided to be invaluable over the next few years, and even Junius, who had a hard time keeping his hands off anything, deferred to Drexel in the matter of railroads. Over time, Pierpont would grow to rely on the advice and counsel of Drexel even more than that of his father. It was also through Drexel that Pierpont made contact with both the Pennsylvania and the Baltimore and Ohio railroads. In 1877, following the death of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the wealthiest man in the U.S., his son opted to sell the Vanderbilt securities in the New York Central Railroad. Drexel Morgan handled the sale, and Pierpont was eventually named director of the railroad. As the firm's railroad interest grew, it became even more important to bring stability to the industry. Overbuilding lines and poor service plagued the industry, which many used for short-term profit rather than long-term gain. In an 1885 meeting aboard Pierpont's yacht in Manhattan, he advised the leading railroad magnates of the day that funding for their investments would cease unless they could agree to stop trying to undercut each other and start working for the good of the industry. Drexel Morgan's influence on the railroad was also felt in the West. In the 1880s, the bank financed the construction of the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific Railroads. The firm's money was also used to build the Southern Railway, a reorganization of almost 150 smaller lines that had previously been in competition with each other. Of equal importance, Drexel Morgan would also help bring stability to the tumultuous securities markets on Wall Street. In 1877, The bank stepped in and underwrote the payment of the U.S. Army when Congress briefly hesitated to authorize funds. The following year, Drexel Morgan gave the initial $1 million capital for Thomas Edison's new electric light company. This infuriated Junius, who believed that electricity was simply a fad. But over his objections, Drexel Morgan's office was one of the first to utilize electric lighting when the switch was flipped for the first time in September 1882. Later, Pierpont would coordinate the merger of Edison Electric General Electric and Thomson-Houston Electric Company, creating General Electric. GE went on to become the leading manufacturer of electronic equipment and appliances in the U.S. Edison. In 1880, Drexel Morgan led a syndicate that developed in Paris to begin construction on the Panama Canal, and in 1895, Drexel Morgan was there to bail out the U.S. government during the Great Panic of that year. The firm would be there again to help bail out the New York Stock Exchange during the Panic of 1907. All of these events occurred at a time when there was no Federal Reserve Bank. The last time the country had a central bank was during Andrew Jackson's presidency. But the Second National Bank lost its charter in 1836. Pierpont was as close as the U.S. came to a central bank until the Federal Reserve Act was created after his death. For Tony Drexel, partnering with Pierpont was a good agreement. He was in his mid-40s when he began working with Pierpont and was already a wealthy man. He and his two brothers were worth at least $40 million by the mid-1880s, while Junius and Pierpont had a net worth of about half of that, with most of it belonging to Junius. This was an era when the average American family made about $500 a year, a tremendous disparity in income that would become a primary focus of reform in the Progressive era. But Drexel was able to keep Pierpont in the spotlight and take the focus off of himself, which is what he preferred. He hated to be the subject of public attention. 2 years after Drexel suddenly died at the age of 66 in 1893, Drexel Morgan was renamed J.P. Morgan & Company, and just as Junius had done with Pierpont, Pierpont began to groom his only son to follow in his footsteps. Jack was sent to Harvard, where he did not find much support in his destiny for a career in commerce. The idea of pursuing a life in something literary or more scholarly was far more appealing than making money to many of Jack's professors, though for his own part, Jack could not see the harm in acquiring wealth. Still, he might have preferred science and showed an aptitude for it, even if there was no question that he was eventually going to be a banker. The Morgan men had always ruled as patriarchs of their family, and even though Pierpont was frustrated with the fact that Jack had a closer relationship with Fanny and that Fanny took her son's side more often than not, Pierpont's word on this matter was final. He raised his son the way his father raised him, from a distance, with high expectations and a critical eye. Chapter 6. Patron of the Arts and Philanthropist. Pierpont's love affair with art truly blossomed as a teenager during his days in Rome, and by the turn of the 20th century, he was the foremost patron of fine art in the U.S. Due to tax laws, which would have resulted in a 20% tariff on his imported works of art, he kept most of his collection at his home in London. His sabbaticals away from banking were usually spent touring the great cities of Europe to see museums and art galleries or admire ruins and great architecture. As his bank account grew, so did his ability to purchase what he liked, and he would do so with great fervor. If there was a shopaholic in the art world, it was Pierpont, who acquired so much that it was not unusual for him to forget what he had purchased. It's fair to say that 19th century America was sorely lacking in what Europeans would describe as high culture, and there were very few places to see fine art in the States. Ironically, it was the wealth of the Gilded Age, as maligned as it was by Americans who were barely getting by, that gave rise to beautiful buildings or pieces of art. Many of the wealthiest Americans wanted what they considered the finer things in life, and they took it upon themselves to see that these things were created. For Pierpont, he collected art because he liked art, history, and beautiful things. It was not something he did to enhance his social status. In 1869, Pierpont helped establish the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and since the museum often operated at a deficit close to $50,000 a year in its early years, and board members were expected to make up that deficit, Pierpont was an active fundraiser. He served as a treasurer, vice president, chairman of the finance committee, and donor of many types of collections, including fossils, relics, costumes, and gems. In 1871, he gave money to the fledgling Metropolitan Museum of Art, though Junius was also one of its earliest board members and more involved than his son. In 1888, the Met broke one of its own rules to bring Pierpont on as a trustee when he would not meet their request to break off ties with the Museum of Natural History. Part of Morgan's gem collection. Pierpont was also deeply involved in the Episcopal Church on both a national and local level. He was the treasurer and senior warden for St. George's Episcopal Church, and he helped revise the Book of Common Prayer in 1886. He also helped finance the Cathedral of St. John the Divine when a poor economy resulted in construction delays. When local churches were unable to pay their clergymen, Pierpont helped underwrite their salaries. Eventually, the walls of Pierpont's home were lined with various paintings, even though paintings were probably what he found least interesting, and he had begun to assemble an impressive library. He owned many works of classic literature, bound in leather, reference works on art, and several original historical and literary manuscripts. He also had a copy of the first Bible written in America in Algonquin, printed in 1663. Pierpont also liked to collect things that most people had not seen or did not have access to, such as medieval jewelry or Chinese porcelain. He even collected things that others may have not considered collectible, thereby rescuing them from obscurity. Dealers in antique books in London kept him apprised of manuscripts as they became available, and in the 1890s, some of his purchases included historical works by Charles Dickens, Rudyard Kipling, Sir Walter Scott, and Leo Tolstoy. The extent of Pierpont's influence on art in the U.S. went far beyond stocking his home with art and other collectibles. After he became president of the Met in 1904, he donated many important pieces from his personal collection, helped underwrite the acquisition of other pieces, and helped initiate the museum's archaeological expeditions to Egypt. He also provided financial support to individual artists, including Edward Sheriff Curtis, who was using the relatively new art of photography to document the decline of the American Indian. Pierpont was also a donor to the local opera, the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, the New York Botanical Garden, and the American Academy in Rome. Over the course of 20 years, Pierpont spent about $60 million on his art collection, and when Junius died, Pierpont's inheritance allowed him to indulge in his love of art even more. There was also more art available to purchase in New York because more Europeans, in need of an immediate cash infusion, increasingly looked for buyers in the U.S. market. In many ways, just as he served as America's central bank, Morgan also served as the nation's primary importer of fine art. Chapter 7. Life After Junius. In early April 1890, Pierpont was on board the Teutonic, a White Star Line ship that later would own a famous luxury liner named the Titanic. Ironically, Pierpont had a ticket for the Titanic's maiden voyage in 1912, but illness caused him to miss the fateful trip. On the Teutonic, he was en route with his daughter Louisa to Monte Carlo to celebrate his and Junius's birthday. Pierpont was going to be 53, and Junius was going to be 77. From there, Pierpont planned to go on to the healing thermal waters of Aix-les-Bains in France, hoping for relief from his eczema and gout. However, while Pierpont was still on board this ship, Junius had a carriage accident in London. Exactly what had happened was not clear, but it is likely that a nearby train spooked the horse, jostling the carriage. Junius fell out, but the driver did not notice Junius was not in the carriage until he was already several yards down the road. When the driver rushed back to retrieve him, he found Junius lying motionless near a wall. Initially, there was hope that Junius might recover from his injuries. He did have a concussion and some broken bones, but there was no sign of paralysis or a fractured skull. When the Teutonic arrived in Ireland, Pierpont was given 2 telegrams. One explained what had happened to his father and said that there was a chance for recovery. The second telegram, sent a day later, said that Junius seemed to be declining. By the time Pierpont and Louisa arrived in Liverpool on April 9th, they received the wire that Junius had died. A month later, Junius was laid to rest in his hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. He left behind an estate worth about $23 million, about $15 million of which went to Pierpont. Today, that would roughly amount to the equivalent of $225 million. Pierpont, while grieving, took the shock of his father's death well. He believed that Junius had led a good, long life, and perhaps there was even a degree of relief at the freedom of true independence for the first time in his life. His inheritance also allowed him to indulge in his love of art even more. Upon his father's death, Pierpont became the head of J.S. Morgan & Company and enjoyed the privileges that his wealth and status provided. One of those privileges was being a yacht owner. He bought his first yacht in 1882 and docked it at Manhattan's New York Yacht Club, which put the prosperity of the Gilded Age on full display. For Pierpont, though, owning a yacht was not about conspicuous consumption, as he seemed to feel more at ease on his boats than anywhere else, and he was known to take refuge there in the evening. He was never truly happy as J.P. Morgan the banker, but he was able to find happiness on the water. When Fanny was out of town, he was known to sleep in the stateroom of his yacht. Picture of the Corsair, one of Morgan's yachts. There certainly was enough room to stay there comfortably. In fact, the yacht he had built after his father's death had 8 staterooms, an oak-paneled saloon, several fireplaces, and steam heat. He even ordered china specifically made for the Corsair. Jack later said he never saw his father happier than when the boat was completed. In 1897, Pierpont was elected Commodore of the New York City Yacht Club and presided over yacht races and among club members. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the government even commissioned the Corsair for battle, though Jack commented that the country would be better off letting his father keep his boat and thereby his health. Nonetheless, the Corsair became the USS Gloucester, and Pierpont used the money given to him by the government to build a new yacht. By this time, the marriage between Fanny and Pierpont had deteriorated to marriage in name only. They spent their 25th anniversary apart, and Pierpont had long ago determined that he would never be able to satisfy her. He remained in Europe with increasing frequency and had discreet romances on the side. That said, had he not been one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, he might have worried about how women would respond to his appearance. His nose grew increasingly deformed due to a skin condition called rhinophema, which resulted from untreated rosacea. Over time, Pierpont's nose began to look like a purple, bumpy bulb that dominated his face. He could have had his nose surgically treated and have the bumps removed, but his fear of having a relapse of his childhood seizures prevented it. Already considered fiery by many, it seemed as if he dared people to comment on his nose. When he was photographed or painted, his nose was usually touched up. The handsome young man that he once was now had his features dominated by a hideous nose. In this picture, Morgan is visibly agitated by the presence of a camera. No matter what the condition of his nose might have been, it did not prevent him from seeking the company of other women. Not long after Junius died, Pierpont began a relationship with Edith Randolph, a widow and friend of the family who often accompanied the Morgans on vacation. Fanny was fully aware that Edith was frequently present at the parties Pierpont had aboard the Corsair, but any questions she had about the nature of their relationship were met with incredulous anger. Pierpont accused his wife of disrespecting Mrs. Randolph with her suggestions that anything immoral was going on. Pierpont made a point to not see Edith in front of his wife after a discussion he had with Fanny in April 1894, but even the gossip columns of the local newspaper made mention of the fact that Fanny and Pierpont Morgan seemed to be spending more and more time on different continents. In 1895, 58-year-old Pierpont began another relationship, this time with 42-year-old Adelaide Townsend. He was likely taken by her similarity to Mimi, since she was adventurous, interested in the arts, and, perhaps best of all, healthy with no propensity for depression. Pierpont seemed to share the philosophy of the British aristocracy of the era, and that he did not see any harm in conducting affairs with women as long as they were discreet. In his case, his own marriage fallen apart, but there was no chance that they would divorce, so he had even more reason to seek companionship elsewhere. He was happy courting other women, much happier than he had ever been with Fanny. Chapter 8. The Final Years and Legacy of J.P. Morgan. A 1903 Portrait of Morgan. As urban America grew, so did the demand for steel. Before the creation of steel, buildings were limited to about 10 stories before the floors simply pancaked on top of each other and collapsed. Steel changed all of that and provided support for soaring skyscrapers that allowed cities to grow up where they could not grow out. In 1900, Morgan began negotiations with Andrew Carnegie and Charles Schwab for the purchase of Carnegie Steel. Carnegie was the steel behemoth's founder, and Schwab was its president. Meanwhile, Elbert H. Gary was the founder of Federal Steel Company in Chicago, and in 1901, Morgan helped finalize the deal that saw Schwab and Gary buy Carnegie's share of his company for a whopping sum of $492 million. Carnegie subsequently set about becoming one of the most prolific philanthropists of the Progressive Era, and U.S. Steel, the nation's first billion-dollar corporation, was born. Schwab. Gary. The same year that U.S. Steel was created, Theodore Roosevelt took office as President of the United States, and though he was certainly a member of America's high society himself, he was firmly on the side of progressivism and vowed to curtail the influence of the industrial titans of the day. Before he took office, the federal government was aligned with big business, but those days were gone during Roosevelt's administration. In 1902, Roosevelt urged Congress to create a Bureau of Corporations, and one of its first targets was Morgan. An antitrust suit was filed against Morgan's Northern Securities Company, the railroad trust in the North. For his part, Morgan was furious that Roosevelt did not discuss the matter privately first, and he even publicly admonished the president for his actions. Ultimately, the Supreme Court forced the breakup of the trust in 1904. Roosevelt. This was just the beginning of troubles for Morgan, who saw the social and political climate of the nation shifting. Big business was now viewed as evil and the playground of the greedy. The future of the Morgan Empire was cloudy for other reasons as well, because unlike his father, Pierpont had not done a thorough job grooming his son to take his place. In fact, he had done no succession plan at all. He had lived completely in the moment, with little thought to how his affairs should be handled after he was gone. It was an interesting paradox for Morgan, because he was certainly at a point in his life where he could have begun the transition out of the career that never gave him much joy anyway. However, he simply found it impossible to give up control. Arsène Pujol, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Lake Charles, Louisiana, became the chair of the House Committee on Banking and Currency in 1911. The functioning of banks was something that had interested him for a while, and he had spent some time reviewing the practices of foreign banks so that he might learn how American banks could operate more effectively. In 1912, he received congressional authority to form the Pujol Committee, charged with investigating the so-called money trust. His belief, shared by others in Congress, was that a select group of bankers and financiers had control of key industries obtained through the public trust, which gave them an inordinate amount of control over the American economy. The man who was squarely in the Pujol Committee's crosshairs was J.P. Morgan. Pujol. 5 years earlier, Morgan was hailed as a hero for bailing out Wall Street during the Panic of 1907, a 6-week period of bank runs in America's largest cities that resulted in the bankruptcy of 2 brokerage firms and left the economy shaken. It was further devastated by the earthquake in San Francisco on April 18, 1906. The city was in ruins, and the amount of money required to save it put an enormous strain on the national economy. When the panic hit Wall Street in October 1907, Morgan was at the Triennial Episcopal Convention in Richmond, Virginia. His partners kept him apprised of the situation, but did not ask him to return to New York, if only because at this point in his life, any sudden change in Morgan's plans sparked national interest. His movements literally impacted the economy, and if it was known that Morgan had rushed back to New York, it would have likely increased the panic. Thus, as soon as the convention was over, Morgan had his private Pullman Railroad car attached to a steam engine and made it back to New York overnight. As soon as he arrived on October 20th, he called a meeting of the key financial leaders in the city, and over the next several weeks, Morgan facilitated the reorganization of several companies. Some of the companies that he deemed beyond saving were left to fail, but of those he deemed worthy of saving, all made it through the crisis, including the Moore and Schley brokerage firm. From all corners of the country, Morgan was praised for saving the U.S. economy. Now in a different social and political climate, Morgan sat before the Pujol Committee to answer questions about his control over the finances of the nation. His children, Louisa and Jack, accompanied him to the hearing in Washington, D.C. in December 1912. Samuel Untermeyer, a corporate lawyer with a strong dislike of the money trust, was the lead counsel in the hearings. In one exchange, Untermeyer asked Morgan if his bank issued credit based on character or property first. Morgan said, "The first thing is character, before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." Indeed, in Morgan's world, character and trust were of foremost importance, but when the hearings concluded, the committee's report declared that there was a money trust in the U.S. that prohibited fair competition. several key bankers, all part of the Morgan Empire, were singled out. The Peugeot Committee findings led to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed into law by President Wilson on December 23, 1913. A cartoon bashing Morgan's alleged statement that he liked a little competition. This political cartoon criticizes Morgan's outsized influence by suggesting he has a bigger impact than America itself. This 1910 cartoon's caption asks, "The central bank, why should Uncle Sam establish one when Uncle Pierpont is already on the job?" Ironically, the man most responsible for the establishment of the Federal Reserve did not live to see it. 2 weeks after he appeared before Congress, Morgan left on a trip to Egypt with Louisa, close friends, and one of his favorite dogs all accompanying him. Typically, journeys across the sea brightened his mood, but this time, Morgan could not shake the depression that was taking over him. The longer it went on, the more agitated he became, so on January 31st, he met with a doctor in Cairo. The doctor assured him he was simply feeling the effects of stress brought on by the recent events back in Washington. But as his ship started up the Nile River, Morgan began to suffer from delusional thinking. He was certain someone was out to kill him, or that there was a conspiracy against him. He refused to eat and said he was afraid that he might jump out the ship's window. No news from Jack regarding the progress of the Peugeot hearings was as upsetting as bad news from Jack. All the while, doctors assured Louisa that her father was fine. They believed it was simply his anxiety again. Nonetheless, Morgan continued to slip into hysteria, convinced that he was dying. He asked for his own doctors, who knew him best, to meet him in Cairo, and when they saw him, Morgan said he was going insane. Indeed, he looked like a man who was losing control of himself and had reached the breaking point after fighting against himself as much as any competitors throughout his life. There appeared to be nothing physically wrong with him, and Morgan was told as much, but he simply could not believe it. He was urged to go back home to New York, but he refused. The plan was for him to go to Rome, and he still wanted to do that, but his delusions did not stop once he arrived in Rome either. He was convinced that he was being watched all the time, and that he would be forced to stay there forever. On March 31st, 1913, Morgan spiked a high fever, and by this time he was lethargic, delirious, and obviously dying. When word got out back in the U.S. that Morgan was critically ill, stocks slumped. He died in his sleep that day in his room at the Grand Hotel. When news of his death reached home, banker Frank Vanderlip wrote, "The king is dead." Wall Street shut down in honor of his memory on April 14th, the day of his funeral, and like his father, he was laid to rest in Hartford, Connecticut. Muckraking journalists such as Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell, who was largely responsible for the breakup of Standard Oil, included Morgan in the mix of big business industrial titans who created wealth for their own benefit. They charged that little of that wealth trickled down to the average worker or family. However, it's only fair to point out that Morgan was an important philanthropist. He may not have been a philanthropist on the scale of Carnegie or Rockefeller, but his wealth was not on the same scale either. Furthermore, like other giants of industry, Morgan came to power at a time when rules of business in the U.S. were still being formed, so it is difficult to completely fault him for taking action at a time when he was literally the only man capable of doing so. There was no central bank in the United States, so Morgan stepped in and played the role himself. It might please Morgan to know that his legacy is not simply tied up in J.P. Morgan Chase, still a global financial company and one of the largest banks in the U.S. He left behind a notable legacy in art and history also. His personal library is the basis for the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, and Jack saw to it that large portions of his father's art collection were donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art after his death. It is no exaggeration to say that Morgan almost single-handedly helped create the American art scene, something that was done for the sheer joy of it. While Morgan battled his own personal demons throughout his lifetime, the legacy that he left behind regarding both the American economy and art will live on for generations to come.